Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Boston Graduate School of Psychoanalysis and our continuing education event on Planet of the Apes. My name is Patricia Hugenberger, and I have the pleasure and it's really not really nice for me to be the head of continuing ed, because as that person, I get to have people come to me and say, I have an idea for an event. It sort of fills itself because people like to talk about their ideas. Continuing education, or our goal for continuing education for, we call ourselves BGSP, Boston Graduate School of Psychoanalysis, BGSP, is to talk about psychoanalysis, talk about the unconscious in the world. It's not something that's talked about a lot, so it's kind of part of our mission. We do a lot of clinical training here, but it really also is events like this that are about movies, about art, that are in politics. We do things on politics sometimes, things that are in the world. The unconscious is in the world. And so I was thrilled when Dr. Barnard told me about Mr. Alwyn's interest in this topic. He presented last year, was it? Somewhere?
Yeah, about a year ago.
About a year ago, and I couldn't go. I was especially pleased because I love this movie. It is such a dramatic movie. And then to be able to hear someone talk about Freud in this movie, what more can you want? What more can someone like people that go to this school want, right? So, and hopefully people that are here, I think there's people here that are here because of your podcast. So, we have a celebrity amongst us. So, I just want to tell you a couple of things. You see evaluations on your seats. We really welcome your input. If you want continuing education units for licensing, for clinical licensing, I have to have one from you. And Ms. Bootsis, the person that checked you in at the front door, will collect the evaluations and give you your certificates at the end. So I think that's about it for now. There's a postcard of our upcoming events. We have something on children and adolescence next Saturday, and a couple more events too. So Mr. Alwyn is a writer, co-host of the Partially Examined Life philosophy podcast, right? And
Yep.
A doctoral student here at BGSP. He lives in Cambridge, where he thinks a lot about the political and moral psychology of film, literature, and contemporary American culture. He gave me a bibliography that I will send to everybody in a follow-up email. I don't have the hard copies, I thought I did. After the event, which will include the link to his podcast, which is pretty easy to find, actually. If you just Google Partially Examined Life, it's really a rich treasure trove of talks. So I'll let him tell you more of what he wants to talk about.
All right. Thanks to everyone for coming. So yeah, I gave this talk a year ago, and now I'm going to do it again. I have more time, apparently, to talk this time, although if I see people getting restless, maybe we'll just move into the question and answer period earlier. Because I have written a lot. I've had another year to think about this. So I didn't think this was that long, and then I realized that it had printed on both sides. And I'm going to spare you me reading this and just try and think out loud. So there may be a little disorganization and pausing and things like that. But yeah, so this is... has anyone been to the zoo recently? This movie is like a very surreal visit to the zoo. And it actually was reminded, thinking about it this time, of the last time I went to the Franklin was it Franklin Park Zoo? And they have a really great gorilla exhibit. And the alpha male, like the silverback gorilla, at least at that time, came out right up to the glass and then made eye contact with me. And I really felt sorry for him because he would never let anyone in the wild, no one would be allowed to make eye contact with him. And he looked pretty furious. But I had that kind of uncanny feeling of, something very, very familiar and related and yet so far away. The familiarity, of course, is just the similarities in form and what we know, but the fact that, we now know that we have a common ancestor with other primates. And, of course, the distance has to do with language and reasoning and the fact that there can't really, even despite that eye contact, there's not really going to be a meeting of the minds ever. We can lock eyes. I can have the idea that he's furious because I'm not respecting his place in the hierarchy. But beyond that, there's no way of working things out. And so that, I think of that as an uncanny experience. And I wanted to, and I think what's so interesting to me about the Planet of the Apes is the way it amps up the uncanniness of that experience by further highlighting our connection to other primates. And it does that. This movie almost didn't get made because of the difficulty of doing that. Ultimately, the makeup artist won an Academy Award, and to make it work, he had to use techniques and prostheses techniques that had been developed to help soldiers who had been disfigured during war. And they had to do that because they had to make the ape characters, they had to give them the ability to express a wide variety of emotions. They had to be able to wrinkle their eyes and move their lips to some extent and do at least some minimal facial expressions to make it at all compelling. Otherwise, the studios thought it would be laughable. And the producer, Arthur P. Jacobs, it took him years to convince the studio to do this. And he actually, in the end, the way he convinced them was to devote a good chunk of money to doing a screen test where they did this makeup and they showed the studios that this was possible. The earliest screenwriter on the project, Rod Serling, who's created The Twilight Zone, I think the way he put it, it was, the whole goal was to convince the studio that you could make apes speak and not get a laugh. And I think laughter, of course, would have undermined that uncanny experience that the movie is supposed to create. Of course, there is a lot of laughter in the movie, but I don't think it's simply, we don't get to look down on the apes and think how silly it is that an animal is speaking like a human being. The laughter, in a way, is always reflected back at humanity. It's a critique of humanity. So, in doing research for the talk this time, I wanted to think about what's so disturbing about this connection to apes. And I looked back at Darwin's Origin of Species and the Descent of Man, and I did some research on reactions to it at the time. And of course, I think the emotion, the overarching emotion that it creates is a sense of shame. There's a shame in this connection. And this is not, that's not the first time historically that it happened. There had been a whole series of sort of shaming moments in human history, the discovery that the Earth was not at the center of the universe, the scientific revolution itself, the idea that things, the soul, for instance, and the psyche could be reduced to mere mechanism. Later, Freud's discovery of the unconscious, another sort of blow to the cultural ego. So this was a significant one, and I think the reaction is, it's kind of a reaction to the sort of origins which suggest the unruliness of instinct and savagery and immorality. In fact, so here, by the way, is the way Darwin puts it in Origin of Species. He just very frankly hits us over the head with this idea of our relatedness. Man is descended from a hairy quadruped, furnished with a tail and pointed ears, probably arboreal in its habits, an inhabitant of the old world. But in the end, towards the end of the Descent of Man, he gives a series of comments which is really telling about what this sort of concern is about. So people weren't just concerned to find out that there is some sort of relatedness to apes. They were worried about the fact that there was common ancestry to all human beings. So for instance, people who were thought of as savages were in fact relatives of the European writers who were writing at the time. So Darwin at the end of the Descent of Man says, basically he would rather be descended from a monkey than, quote, a savage who delights to torture his enemies, offer up bloody sacrifices, practices infanticide without remorse, treats his wives like slaves, knows no decency, and is haunted by the grossest superstitions. So it's a strange sort of statement because you could make the charge of savagery and extreme cruelty stick for all human beings, including, the colonizers who had treated indigenous peoples, the people that they're calling savages, so poorly. But more generally, I think there's this, it's related to this idea that there's something wrong with the instinctual, and the more we are connected to it, that's a kind of a dangerous thing. Another thing the way that Darwin puts it is that despite our intellect, despite our self-consciousness, we will always bear, quote, in our bodily frame, the indelible stamp of our lowly origin. So there's something about the physiology of it. This creature who looks so much like us in a way, but is more, evokes this idea of instincts which are savage and immoral. So I call this leads us into what I call the misanthropic thesis, which is that basically what ails society, what's responsible for, as Taylor puts it in the movie Man's Inhumanity to Man, or does he say that? He may not say it that way, and the idea is that it's just that we're not civilized enough, that there's too much unruly instinct at work in society, too much savagery, too much of our ape nature rising up, and the way to get beyond that is to become more civilized. In Taylor's case, he's willing, right, to go millions of miles away and thousands of years, 2,000 years into the future to escape the lowly origin that is Earth. And he thinks of human beings, it's interesting because later on in the movie he'll say, I'm not a missing link. He writes that down. He calls human beings a missing link at the very beginning of the movie. He thinks of human beings as a missing link between apes and some higher form of life, some superior being that he's going to find out there in the universe, this ideal. So I call this the misanthropic thesis because it's basically, it takes man's human inhumanity and it blames the instinctual, blames something that we really that really will turn out to be inherently a part of our nature, and not something that can be eradicated by civilization. And I think in the end, the movie, what's so fascinating about the movie is that it's a rejection of this thesis. It's a rejection of the idea that what ails society is simply that there's too much instinct run amok. So, by the way, this whole missing link thing, that was a concern at Darwin's time. There were skeptics who wanted to know, well, if we do share a common ancestor with apes, why in the fossil record aren't there these missing links, these intermediate forms? Of course, later on we have found some of those forms, and they, I think if you look at, say, for instance, a recreation of Homo habilis, they do sort of look in between ape and human being. But for the way it turns out in the movie, instead of finding these higher forms that he was hoping to find when he gets to the planet, what he finds is sort of a parody of his idea of the notion of human beings as missing links. So, let's see. Or in other words, he finds an exaggeration of that Darwin's comment about the indelible stamp of our lowly origin. So, so the movie holds culture and language constant. The apes have that, but they retain their original forms. It's a sort of exaggeration of the idea of a missing link between ape and higher form. The apes actually are sort of stand in that relation. The apes on the planet of the apes stand in that relation, that missing link relation between actual apes and the higher forms that he hopes to find. And they it basically foregrounds and exaggerates the physical similarity between apes and human beings. So, and I think that successfully highlights this idea that escaping such origins is not actually possible. I think, so one of the delights of the film is that Taylor himself is such a charismatic misanthrope and a complete narcissist. So despite talking about, human cruelty, we see all that wonderful cruelty in the beginning, how mean he is to his fellow astronauts. It's like he went on the whole mission just to make fun of them for, their sense of loss, having left the Earth behind, for their attachment to anything, for their identifications. Someone plants the American flag and he has that maniacal laugh. So on the one hand, he's talking like a 60s kind of countercultural radical. On the other, he has that space cowboy braggadocio and arrogance, and it's such an interesting conflict that I think it's what at least draws me into the movie. So Taylor holds this misanthropic thesis and he sort of embodies it. But as I said before, the film is going to reject it. It's going to reject it by basically highlighting the ills that are inherent to the cultural. So when he gets to that world, we find that these ape humanoids, they have a hierarchy and they have cultural institutions, and they have all the sorts of closed-mindedness and oppression and things that go along with it. And they also are, particularly nasty to the speechless human beings who live on the planet. So I think and we're going to find out that there's nothing to suggest that it's their apeness that's to blame for that, or their animality or their instinctuality that's to blame for that. Rather, it's something that has to do with culture. So the fact that sort of structure of the movie made me think of a whole series of philosophers who sort of share that idea, Rousseau, Nietzsche, and Freud, this idea that it's not instinct that's the problem, but there's something about civilization that's a problem. So I think of them as sort of history's three greatest lawyers for the instinct. The instinct has been bad-mouthed historically, and they're going to step up finally to the plate and argue that there's something good about instinct. So Rousseau. In 1755, Rousseau wrote an essay called Discourse of the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men. It was a prize essay, and the contest, the people who submitted essays were asked to sort of explain what the origin of inequality is in human society, explain what ails human civilization, and Rousseau conceives of this problem in terms of things like wealth, rank, power, prestige, that sort of inequality. Prior to Rousseau, state of nature theorists like Hobbes had conceived of the transition from what they called a state of nature, this hypothetical state before the existence of societies and mores and laws, as something that was just unequivocally good, the transition from nature to society, and that life went from being nasty, brutish, and short, in the words of Hobbes, to something much nicer and cooperative, where the instincts, sexual and aggressive instincts, were curtailed, and life was generally better. And Rousseau, in typical Rousseau fashion, says, no, it was actually better before. And he charges Hobbes with a conceiving of human beings in the state of nature in a sort of illegitimate way, where he's thinking of these beings who can already speak and already reason as just being in a sort of lawless kind of chaos. Rousseau wants to think about the state of nature as involving beings who are speechless, cannot reason, basically animals in human form, and which may put us into missing link territory. Actually, I think it's unclear scientifically when language began. I think the speculation is somewhere between 50,000 and 2 million years ago, but I don't think it's. I think it's possible that if we're talking about a creature that doesn't use language, they might not actually look like human beings, entirely like human beings, as in Rousseau's formulation. Instincts come in two flavors for Rousseau. One is what he calls self-love, an instinct towards self-preservation, which includes the sexual instincts, and the other is basically a primitive form of empathy. And what civilization does, he thinks, is it messes up that primitive form of empathy. It interferes with it, and human cruelty is predicated on the interference with empathy. How does it do that? Well, it does that by way of self-awareness, essentially. There's a whole host of interrelated concepts for Rousseau: self-awareness, self-consciousness, and the ability to use language, to reason, to use concepts. All of those things go together, but critically, they involve this ability to internalize, to have a fantasy of another being's awareness of you. So to be self-conscious is to, in some way, to be critically related to the one's, to have an idea of another conscious being's consciousness of you, consciousness of your consciousness. And one's individuality is predicated on that, one sense of safety. Let's put it this way. So he describes situations in which So for an animal, right, if there's a fight and one of the animals gets injured, the injured animal forgets about it. They're not stewing over it. They're not thinking about how they're going to get revenge. They would have defended themselves in the moment, and then they would have forgotten about it. What does a human being do? They don't just feel the pain of the injury, but they feel disrespected, insulted. That dynamic reflects what happens with a self-conscious being, which is that in a way, the disrespect can be more painful than the actual injury. The narcissistic injury can actually be more painful than the physical injury. The idea that this other consciousness has not comported itself adequately to you, recognized your humanity, let's say, is a tormenting thing, and people will essentially retaliate. Also, more generally, people will live their lives according to what they think other people think of them, and according to, we think about this in terms of the superego and the internalization of cultural norms and all that stuff. We're ruled in a way by other people's desires, by other people's conception of what is right and what is good. So it's at that moment where we feel insulted or disrespected, or we feel like something immoral has been done to us, that our primitive natural empathy has been interfered with. So Rousseau has a lot of great, really nasty things to say about civilization. A thinking man is a depraved animal. Mind depraves the senses. It is reason which turns man's mind back on itself and divides him from everything that could disturb or afflict him. Which is to say that, we can talk about that later. And then he gives a list of vices: vanity and envy and all the sorts of things that come with being a self-conscious being. The savage lives within himself, while social man lives constantly outside himself and only knows how to live in the opinion of others, so that he seems to receive the consciousness of his own existence merely from the judgment of others concerning him. We're always asking others what we are, and never daring to ask ourselves. So Rousseau has taken this idea of savagery, which later on Darwin, of course, deploys to mean brutishness and immorality, and he suggested that it's actually the more noble of states and the more empathetic of states. So Nietzsche gives a related, I'm not going to go in detail into it, but it's he gives a related bashing of morality. Nietzsche wants to tell us how morality has actually screwed things up, and the curtailment of instinct and the turning back of instincts on ourselves has actually made us sick. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip a little beyond that, and we can talk about it in the discussion. And then getting to Freud. And Nietzsche can be quite extreme about this. So in Twilight of the Idols, for instance, he'll say, all that is good is instinct, and happiness equals instinct. He's not as extreme about it as he sounds right there, because he's not someone who thinks we can simply revert back to the instinctual, nor does Rousseau. But you can see that he's a strong defender of instinct against and a strong opponent of shame, let's say. Freud, it's remarkable when you read Civilization and its discontents, how much is similar to Nietzsche. There's a more detailed story there about what it means for our instincts, for the expression of our instincts to be thwarted by civilization through morals, mores, and turn back on ourselves. So for Nietzsche, a lot of it was about the turning back of aggression on ourselves, which we might think of in Freudian terms as a harsh superego. And Freud does talk quite a bit about that in Civilization and its Discontents. The cultural superego actually, and which is something that we all, most of us internalize, actually can tend to be quite harsh. But there is also the factor of identification with others. So one of the things that happens with the curtailment of our instincts is that they get, for Freud, redirected. And in the creation of civil society, they get redirected and towards, so individual sexual and aggressive instincts get redirected towards what he calls aim-inhibited libido, which is identification, he calls it. And it's what allows us to form ties of fondness and community to other people, which aren't strictly sexual in nature. They are aim-inhibited, they are desexualized. And again, that's accomplished through identification. But so he gives us a hint there of another way in which civilization can be problematic, and I'll get to that in a second because I think it joins back to Rousseau. But another important factor there is the fact that identification it's also an important psychological developmental step for Freud. So it's something so for instance, the resolution of the Oedipus complex, according to Freud, involves a letting go of a libidinal attachment, say, to the mother, and compensating oneself for that by identifying with the father, for instance. It's more complicated than that, especially as Freud went on, he complicated that picture. But as Freud puts it in another place, I cannot have mother, so I must be like father. The compensation there is a narcissistic compensation. The libido that has been thwarted from being discharged on the mother gets redirected towards the ego. The ego, in a way, becomes a substitute. It becomes a pacifier. And that is the process of identification which builds up, according to Freud, the superego, the ego and the id, which is really a great little book/essay, goes into really nice detail about all of that. He thinks of this whole process of identification as really formative of character and personality and individuality. So it is integral to what we think of as separation and individuation, from the leaving of early, merger with the maternal object and development of a sense of self. See where I am. So I think identification is a tricky concept, but I want to point you to the fact that it's related to Rousseau's conception of having having a fantasy of another conscious being's consciousness of you. Freud actually, he, strangely enough, he doesn't really go into great detail, as far as I know, into the mechanics of identification, but we do get a hint in new introductory lectures about, because early on for him, it's just the concept of imitation, right? I might compensate myself for loss of mother with, say, an aspiration to be like my father, or to be a doctor like my father, or some other figure, or just taking on paternal qualities, various paternal character qualities. Those are I compensate myself simply by imitating. But really, when we think about identification, we're thinking about conforming to the norms and desires of others, of a society. We become aware of the consciousness of others, and we try to conform ourselves to it to some extent. We become aware of what's right and wrong. We become aware of what's prestigious and not prestigious, and we develop an identity around conformity to the consciousness of others, just in exactly the way that Rousseau was describing. So, as Freud puts it later on in new introductory lectures, we can think of, we don't just think of it in terms of imitation, but we think of it in terms of structuring, using the superego of others as a model via which we structure our own superego. And so this psychological function identification, which is so important to the formation of communities and to one sense of individuality, actually turns out, as on Rousseau's account, to have a flip side, to have a negative side. It becomes the thing that's also responsible for human cruelty and inequality and all the things that ail civilization. And I think we can think of the way it does that is by inviting us into, I think we're always invited to identify with others, and we're always looking to others to form a certain kind of mirror to us, one that is syntonic or confirming of a certain kind of self-image. And it can be disturbing. So beyond Rousseau's account of, I've been disrespected, therefore I want revenge, it can merely be the otherness of another that invites feelings of aggression and brutality, because I'm not mirrored back in the way I want to be mirrored back. My identity can come under threat. And I can always, in disavowing my own instinctive nature, I can always create an account in which otherness is savage or is overly imbued with the instinctual. And so I'm projecting the instinctual outside of myself or other disavowed parts of the self, and then going to war against it externally. So I think I wanted to get at that sense in which we can move even beyond Rousseau towards the way in which identification can lead to human cruelty, just by holding up this a kind of mirror which reflects back to us not our wholeness, not a coherent sense of self, but something that is fragmented. So it does the opposite. If you think about, if you recall Lacan's mirror stage, where we invent this coherent sense of self and an ego by looking at a coherent physical body in the mirror, it does the opposite of that. It reflects back to us fragmentation and undermines our sense of self. So we could look at, mere differences in physical form, ethnic differences, cultural differences, all of those things can be exploited all of those things can feel troubling to one's own sense of identity. By way of identification, by way of an initial identification, and then a jarring sense that I have not been adequately reflected back. Or that I have had these sort of origins in the instinctual reflected back to me, these things that I want to disavow. Sorry, I'm going a little bit quickly now because I know I'm running out of time, but
you can go as long as you want.
Okay.
Whatever makes sense for you, for us.
Sorry. So this is what I'm getting at here is that feeling of uncanniness that I started the talk with. This is directly related to that. So in Freud's essay on the uncanny, he gives us a lot of different examples of the uncanny, and generally it's a sort of disturbing feeling you get from things which are simultaneously familiar and unfamiliar. So examples include doubts about whether an animate being is actually alive. I think the example we're all most familiar with is in robotics, something that looks very, very much like a human being, but doesn't look quite enough like a human being, and we know it's not conscious. Manifestations of insanity, because they, quote, excite in the spectator the impression of automatic mechanical processes at work behind the ordinary appearance of mental activity. Cases of repetition, which suggest we're subject to this sort of inescapable fate. Things which seem to suggest a return of the repressed. So what's happening there is ultimately, and this is something elaborated by the Bulgarian French philosopher Julia Kristeva, but the uncanny invites us into a place where, back to maternal merger and to a point where the self is dissolved, or separation, individuation is undone. It's like, so the familiarity part of the uncanny is like the home or the womb, the thing that we all know and we've all been there, but it's unknowable, and in the sense that it has to be repressed, because going back there, going back to that kind of home would mean the end of self-consciousness, the end of being of individuality. It would mean dissolution of the self. So when you're looking at the apes in this movie, or the ape / the ape humanoids, the speaking apes, I think that amped up sense of uncanniness it highlights this sort of threat of being reminded of these instinctual origins or origins in merger, and the danger that represents to the self. And it suggests to us that is, and it doesn't have to be explicitly a feeling of the uncanny, but that feeling of a distorted mirror is actually the explanation for cruelty and inequality in society. Not the instinctual, but the fear and disavowal of the instinctual in such a way that we basically project that onto others and then attack it. And so I just want to briefly, in thinking about Taylor, so really what we're talking about is separation, individuation. And I think it's pretty clear that Taylor has a problem with that. So, in other words, he has to completely separate himself from the earth. He has to go thousands of miles, millions of miles away, and 2,000 years into the future. He has to escape those origins, which he's disavowed as bad, in terms of man's inhumanity to man, and he's moved in the direction of this ideal, this higher human form, or some sort of utopia far away. So you can see that as a kind of splitting, getting away from the bad object and looking for an ideal, which makes me think of narcissistic pathologies, and which I think are fundamentally problems of separation and individuation that have to do with that process going awry during pre-Oedipal development. So it makes sense that Taylor is a narcissist, and that he, his character is perfectly set up to get us towards the thesis of the movie, what I take to be the thesis of the movie, which is the rejection of the misanthropic thesis that Taylor advocates. So here's one really poignant thing. This may be the most poignant thing that Taylor says in the movie. Imagine me needing someone. Back on Earth, I never did. Lots of lovemaking, but no love. That was the kind of world we'd made. So I left because there was no one to hold me there. The movie highlights what I think of as the arbitrary or trivial basis of identification. So a lot of it is just about similarity in physical form, right? The apes speak, have language and culture, so does Taylor. Everyone knows that, but it's enough for them that he has a repulsive, repugnant physical form, human form, and it's enough for Taylor. They're damn dirty apes because they look like apes. They completely disregard the criteria of reasoning and speaking and culture. And what was I going to say about that? And that is something, that's something you see in that you see in human oppression of others. So it could be ethnic differences, but it could also be trivial cultural differences. Those sort of things become the means by which we demonize others. Okay. So to end this, I'm gonna sum up my thesis here, which is that this misanthropic thesis, this idea that all we need is more civilization and to disavow or get away or develop beyond instinct. The suggestion of the movie and the the suggestion that I get by combining Rousseau and Freud and Nietzsche is that not only is that thesis wrong, but the holding of that thesis is actually the problem. The idea that we have to get away from the instinctual, disavow it, project it onto others, and in the process of identification, find it in others and feel the need to reestablish our identity by destroying them or oppressing them. That is actually the problem. So this mechanism of identification, which makes community and selfhood possible, makes individuality possible, is the source of our troubles as well. And so it's not really that easy just to get away, to get rid of instinct. We have to do something else, and we can discuss that, what we might have to do during the discussion period. So, all right, thank you.
Thank you.
So, sat through 51 minutes. That was.
You put a lot of thought into that. It's really quite amazing. So, thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
In our dreams class last week, we had to read Freud's The Three Coffins essay, and in that he talks about how just like in folklore and like fairy tales, like men are, like, I don't remember the actual stories he talks about, but that there'll be 3 women that are chosen for his loved one, and usually the right one to pick is the one that's mute or dumb. And then Freud talks in this paper about how that dumb woman represents death. And so while I was watching this, I was thinking the whole time how he, the woman he keeps is, I mean, granted, it was the only woman given to him, but just like him going off into the sunset with this mute, beautiful woman, it's like him writing off of death. So,
Interesting.
so.
He was to find his destiny.
His destiny, yeah.
His,
Yeah, his destiny for Dr. Zayas is self-destructive. The self-destruction that he sees as inherent in humanness, which he's going to find in the form of the remnants of the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah.
So.
That scream at the end. What does he say? You maniacs.
He blew it all up, yeah.
It's
So-
actually riveting to hear it because it feels a little too possible.
And it's such a poignant moment because he, his whole defense had been this idea that I don't care about the earth, about Mother Earth. I've transcended that. I've gotten away from that. And you other astronauts, how silly it is of you to mourn it. The amount of contempt early on in the movie is really amazing. And in the end, of course, he learns that he actually hasn't undone that tie, and that by, I think of it as leaving, as staying by going, by his attempt to actually leave was just another way of staying. If you think of Freud's Mourning and Melancholia, you can think of the way in which, if an object has disappointed you and the melancholic abruptly cuts ties to the object consciously, so they leave, but unconsciously, that's in order to maintain a permanent unconscious connection through identification. So this is where actually Freud first explicates this concept of identification. But so yeah, he seems to learn to mourn in the end. I don't know, because he had a lot of moments where it seemed like he had learned something, but then, he's suddenly arrogant again. Like, when they give him the gun and it's, and they have that realization, wow, we went through all this trouble to save him, and it turns out he's just a dick, basically. Like, but yeah.
Have you thought about the denial of history about this? Like, the denial of the Holocaust, for example. So the apes are denying what really is true, that the history was. They knew the history.
Yeah.
And they were keeping it from, which goes on in human nature too. I don't know if that's instinctual self-preservation, some sort of, I don't know what that has to do with self-preservation of some kind of order, but, like totalitarianism, or I don't know, just, but they knew the truth, which was on still.
Yeah.
You can see it right today in the environment of, our government, Russia, whatever government you want, this journalist that just disappeared.
Yeah.
So it's still pretty kind of rattling to me. And the more danger of atomic holocaust happening.
Yeah.
There's now even cyber stuff going on. It's like, geez, I don't know.
that makes me think, who's the ape? Who's the human being and who's the ape in the reality?
What was that?
That makes me think, who's the human being, who's the ape in the reality?
They're both the human being and the ape. So, and this whole idea of who's the savage and who isn't, that's what the that's essentially the misanthropic thesis, right? There are savages, and then there are humans, and they're bad and we're good. But I think that's what the film wants us to move beyond. Yeah.
There's so many levels of miscommunication or non-communication in this movie. It's so interesting. I mean, Taylor sits in a room with apes who speak in English, and he doesn't realize he's on his own planet.
Yeah.
The woman, the mute woman, she has so much nonverbal communication, and yet he sees her possibly as just an ape in human form. The apes can't see that the human is a sentient being because he looks differently from them. And it's in your face in this film. You just want to, throw up your hands in the air. How come they don't hear each other? How come they don't understand each other? I found that fascinating.
I found it's a momentary, suspension of disbelief, and especially when I saw the movie in 1968. And you do not make immediately the connections between, hey, but they speak English, they do this, and there are clearly clues now throughout the movie that it's still planet Earth. But I want to go to what you said about Hobbes and Rousseau's and Nietzsche and Freud. It's the dichotomy of instinct versus their instincts are bad. We have to adopt them or deny them. Freud doesn't do that. Freud actually is a lot more integrates. He actually, I would ask, how do they define instinct? Well, Freud defines the instincts at a much lower level of impulses, drives, and tries to give them a kind of general engine of human behavior and the building blocks of our psyche. So that's why at times when you talk about identification or with others at this very advanced rational meaning, we already have words, we already have fantasies. It's a much more advanced adult stage, rather than what Freud describes as primary narcissism versus secondary narcissism.
Yeah, Freud does think there is a form of identification during the stage of primary narcissism, though. So before we even have object ties, he thinks we have a form of primitive identification, strangely enough, too.
Sure, that's why I think that generally analysts work with these lower forms of identification and separation anxiety, and the canny and uncanny, the fear of the unfamiliar at the pre-Oedipal stage is totally different than, I want to get away from this planet because I no longer like the ideals of the society. It's a separation anxiety, a separation that is so much later stage, very much like teenagers at some point have to distance from their parents and find other kind of ideals. But getting back to the kind of narcissistic injury that people felt when Darwin came with his idea, I was almost tongue-in-cheek thinking, instead of saying we're like apes, and then when he invented the reptilian brain, if they said, we're doing this because of we're reptiles, we would have been there as frustrated, as narcissistically injured. They say you're more like crocodiles than the apes. So
They don't look so much like crocodiles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Freud basically
The indelible
says,
stamp, Darwin's. The fact that we look like them is part of the problem. Yeah.
So Freud actually says instincts are not the problem, or the drives, or the impulses, actually. It is the civilization that did not do a good, he starts the civilization in its discontents with civilization and culture and makes a right. And he says, the one that is the criminal, the wayward, and so on, is somebody who has not been civilized enough. We learn through culture and civilization to control our basic instincts, and then we can identify with the norms, morals, and so on of a society. So that's why I think Freud is a lot more, integrative of all these ideas that philosophers advance through centuries. I don't know what you.
Well, I think so. I think, yeah. I mean, I think. What was I going to say about that? I think so. Freud. Here's the thought that sorry, is he's rather in Civilization is Discontents and it's Discontents and elsewhere. He's pretty pessimistic about. He understands the solution, and it's the same thing as for Nietzsche, is sublimation. Ultimately, it's to sublimate the instinctual into something more constructive, and to get. And identification is part of that. Identification is compensatory, and narcissistic libido in general. It's the ways which plays a big role in sublimation. It's the way we can achieve some kind of satisfaction, even if we can't just willy-nilly discharge our sexual and aggressive impulses whenever we like on others. But he doesn't come across as very optimistic about all that. He gives a nice laundry list in Civilization and Discontents of the various forms of sublimation, including the arts. And he suggests that the cultural superego, part of the problem is too harsh a cultural superego that has to be attenuated. But there's nowhere where he suggests, as far as I know, that we can just live in happy harmony with civilization, that we're going to solve the problem of having our instincts curtailed. I think he thinks there's inherently at least some misery and neurosis that goes along with being civilized. So in that sense, he's very similar to Rousseau. So,
his letter to Einstein,
yeah.
Why War?
Yeah.
Where he's actually very pessimistic about the future of mankind. Yes.
I was going to say, in terms of the uncanny aspect and the use of humor in the film, one thing I found really interesting in terms of, sort of some of the uncanniness is just one sort of in general, kind of your thoughts on these moments in the film when they use like ape or simian in place of human for sort of well-known phrases, like they say the proper study of ape is ape, or simian nature, simian kindness,
Human see, human do.
Right, human see, yeah, or that's the reverse. Yeah, so I was wondering about in terms of sort of the uncanny nature of those sort of turns of phrase.
Yeah, I think so those are, all those funny, ironic reversals that they do in the film. It's a good source of, comic relief for one thing, but also,
all look the same.
yeah.
Oh yeah, that too.
Yeah. But they highlight, what I think they do, they highlight the trivial basis of identification. So the fact that it, so for this, so to say, what did he say during the funeral? Did you?
Yeah, it was a gorilla to remember.
Yeah.
A font of
simian kindness and all that.
Yes,
he never met an ape he didn't like.
Yeah. So this idea of saying apeness or simianness on the one hand, or humanness on the other, as identified with being civilized and compassionate and moral.
Right.
It's meant to suggest that has something to do with, being advanced and civilized and the capacity to speak and all that stuff. But in the end, it's just a matter of prejudice. It's just a matter of a shared physiological form. Identification often comes down to, it relies on something that arbitrary and primitive which is not surprising because our libidinal ties, right? The configuration of our libido is arbitrary as well, right? We're sort of evolutionary engineered, for instance, to direct our sexual instincts for the most part, other than certain perversions, at other human beings and not in animals. But and our sense of disgust at the idea of doing that with animals is just a result of that sort of engineering. It's a great moment in the movie when that interspecies kiss is another one of those great moments in the movie where they both overcome that sense of disgust, which is really in the end completely trivial, completely based on physical otherness. So I think the movie highlights that, it's a send-up of that story that we tell ourselves that other people are savages, and my disgust with them is about the fact that they're savages. It's really just about their otherness. And and this whole idea too of, he's accused of basically just aping intelligent behavior, right, throughout the movie. So that's another one of the great ironies. He's accused of just imitating, which again is it's a more, in this case, it would be a bastardized form of identification. They're denying that he can actually engage with them as another self-conscious creature. So this idea of, I think that idea of another being aping, that again is another way of talking about the uncanny. This idea of another being that isn't really conscious, but somehow apes the behavior of something that's conscious is inherently disturbing. So,
I'm not very good with names, but the boss, the chief, is Dr. Zira or
Zayas, Dr. Zayas.
Zayas. Okay, yes. How do you see him? I
like that guy.
I see him as a control freak, that rationalized all his impulses and wants to keep. He has developed a god. What do you call that? Syndrome. And he acts as he wants to save mankind or ape kind from the basic instincts. How do you see him?
Well, who do you like better, Taylor or Zayas?
Taylor.
Because Taylor also is arrogant and
That's true,
close-minded and
but I don't see
prejudiced.
him as human.
Yeah.
He chooses for wife somebody who doesn't have a big mouth. I'm kidding, Greta. But
Remember, on that planet, monogamy is very easy, and your choice of mates are all mute. So.
I see, right. In the country of the mutes, one syllable is king. So, I don't see him as on that level of narcissism. He is the secondary narcissism, evolved narcissism. And he gets through his changes because he's forced by the environment. So how do you see the big chief?
It's a good question. I haven't, maybe I haven't given enough thought to Zayas, Dr. Zayas.
It's a question tailored for you.
It's funny because I had mentioned to you before the talk that I had actually had a dream about this movie. I think when I was 5. I think I had seen it that early. I have, some of my earliest memories are dreams from when I'm about 5 years old. And it's a dream of an orangutan in a field next to some sort of screen, TV screen or something. And then it's like on an American prairie in the Old West, which some of this film evokes. Not the prairie part, but the Old West part. And then there's a buffalo with a cannon in its side, and that shoots, it's a gun that shoots out of the side of the buffalo. Instead of being shot and exterminated, the buffalo has the, I don't know how to explain that dream. That's why I didn't really bring that up in the talk per se. But something about, the orangutans are the most affecting in a way, I think, in the movie. it's something about I don't know how to explain it, but the fact that they're highest up in this caste system, all of them seem to be doctors. Well, everyone seems to be doctor except the gorillas, but and that level of arrogance and self-consciousness and closed-mindedness, having the capacity to be handed a paper airplane and and you're supposed to be a scientist, and instead of testing it, you just crumple it. There's that great scene where the camera just zooms in and then there's a pause, a beat, and he crumples the paper airplane. But it's such a, it's as far away, I think, from the instinctual as you can possibly get. You see a lot more, well, yes and no, but it's there's a high degree of like narcissistic redirection going on, and there's less in the other the other apes in the film, right? The gorillas are discharging their aggression all over the place and doing lots of nasty things, and they're oafish and they're sadistic, and then the chimpanzees are soft-hearted scientists, full of passion and interest in truth. And it's the orangutan, the highest caste, the most powerful, that truly take that the sins of civilization, or what ails civilization to its extreme. So
it felt to me like he was like the ultimate of paranoia, and it was the drive was self-preservation. But didn't he say at the end, "You humans, I know about you. You destroyed yourselves.
Yeah.
So we can't get near you." So I like your idea of the otherness, but it was based on truth.
Yeah,
History.
so that's why I asked the question of whether you like him better than Taylor, because
Airplane on purpose.
yeah, exactly. He turns out actually to be somewhat redeemed in the end.
Yeah. And even Taylor, in his arrogance, he had a life drive that you just wanted to applaud. The way he ran away.
Yeah.
He didn't go, yeah.
Yeah, it was great.
And
It's
you
great.
saw little pieces of him. Remember on the spaceship, he says, "I'm lonely." You saw little bits of feeling come out, and then he'd go to, like what you say, the defensive side, right?
Yeah.
But even with the woman, he was entertaining love. I mean, I don't know, a little bit of a romantic on this, but, and it felt like a mother and an infant when he smiled at her and she smiled back.
Mm-hmm.
That
Right.
felt like identification at a very early level.
Yeah.
She was like,
I taught you to smile, he
yes,
says. Yeah.
yes. So there was like, well, even though he was so awful to her, there was something where he seemed to be acknowledging a longing that he had not let himself have for a long time. So I was hopeful that even though it was awful, in the end he would, they'd make babies.
Camp out.
Be okay.
Maybe they could live at the top of the Statue of Liberty.
That's right. My denial of like how awful this is such a so sad.
I'm glad that you brought up Dr. Zayas. And I'm also glad that you brought up Freud's letter to Einstein and his pessimism on the subject of war. When I first thought of the question, is civilization killing us? It made me think that civilization allows for a concentration of power that can kill the species and lead to that Statue of Liberty in the sand moment.
Right, I don't think there's actually I mean, look at us now, right? There's a lot of great parts of civilization and working together, and things really have improved. So I don't think it's civilization as a whole. It's just the concentration of power and maybe, and those people who end up in those roles tend to be, I guess, gravitating towards these.
Yeah, Zayas represents that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
He's the defender of the faith.
Right, and I guess, I mean, the most disturbing part is they always think that, they don't see themselves as doing anything wrong. Like, they think they're usually doing something positive, even though from the outside it's
Destructive.
usually not. Yeah.
And self-preservation.
Freud sees religion as a rationalization of very primitive instincts or drives. Okay. So if you think that in the history of mankind, more people died because of religious beliefs, belief comes before reason, right? And we are all acting mostly because the instincts, not the instincts, the drive, the unconscious takes over, it makes us act out. So the defender of the faith that you see in the movie, the blocking of the idea of evolution, you see the guy who's, right? You all have in the movie in different forms. And of course, art is talking, is a lie that talks about the truth.
Yeah, I think I prefer Taylor to Zaius because Zaius is actively destroying the truth. He knows what the truth is and he's blowing up the cave.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he claims to be a scientist, but
thinking he's preserving some kind of order and difference from that.
by erasing
That's
the
the
truth.
irony.
He's deciding for others. Again, that concentration
Sounds
of power.
true.
He's also better looking than. Come on, you agree?
Oh my god.
But I do feel like Zaius, at the end, I really did feel like I got him and I sympathize with him, and I do think he's responding to a trauma, seeing a whole civilization and and wanting to protect yourself. I feel like that seems very instinctual, as well.
Yes.
And in a way, he's protecting something, but Taylor really, I don't know, I don't know what he was protecting.
Well, in a way, they're doing the same thing, right? Taylor leaves the Earth. Taylor and Zaius both want to leave it all behind. Taylor wants to leave the, man's inhumanity to man behind on Earth and find something better in the future. And Zaius has the same idea that after this nuclear holocaust, he can erase the past and completely move beyond it. And both those ideas are ultimately flawed because there is no way to actually move beyond that part of our nature. There are ways to, which is not to say there aren't good parts of civilization, right? And we don't want to talk about sublimation and those things, but I want to emphasize the predicament that the very thing for Rousseau and my interpretation of Freud, the very thing that gives us the capacity to empathize and to live communally and to be kind to others, that very psychological mechanism is, and allow us to be self-conscious and use language, that very psychological mechanism is what is also responsible for cruelty and oppression. And what's important about that is that this idea that we can simply cast off cruelty and oppression and the instinctual is what actually makes it worse. We have to accept that part of ourselves to some extent and integrate it and mourn the fact that we're not going to get that ideal. We're not going to find our own ideal higher form with which we can identify and borrow those ideal qualities from. We have to accept that flawedness, integrate it, and then I think we can manage it. We can manage it better by splitting things up into you're savage, you're civilized, you're the bad one, you're the good one. We just repeat that. We repeat that pattern. So.
Yeah, that's your whole point, is
Yeah.
that,
I was surprised that the woman scientist was introduced but not allowed to live, to be included in the story.
Yeah.
And as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, women are sometimes more associated with instinctually. And she certainly went, Taylor certainly did, compare the two women that.
But it's also with empathy. Women are, even Freud said that probably women are better equipped to be analysts because of their natural empathy. And it's displayed by, the pair. One is more dogmatic, the fiancé, right? While who's actually reaching out and understanding Taylor is the woman. The ape,
The female. So the female scientist who dies, he calls her Eve at some point. And her death does set up a lot of really fun, mean things that Taylor says about, she was to be, we're not going to be propagating the species now, it's over. He says a lot of things really flippantly about this being the end. We've left everything behind. The groceries are going to run out soon, and all of this without any concern. He talks about her death without much concern. And the fact that the species can no longer be promulgated. So his idea is to leave everything behind, and I think if the woman survives, it's actually harder to do that. You carry, there's a possibility of a new colony, would bring Earth with it, right? It would bring all those things he's trying to leave behind with them.
That's a sure way to do it.
Yeah.
I have a question. What's those scarecrow represent in the beginning of the movie?
The what?
The scarecrows. Yeah, I was wondering about that.
So, yeah, I think the real story is actually, there was and I don't remember specifically, but there was a part of the movie that was edited out that actually paid off that scene and explained it, and I forget what it is. So it's just it's a weird part of the movie, yeah, because it's never really explained, and whatever explained it was left on the cutting floor. But it, they might have left it in because it, it's your first sign, right? The scarecrows are left there by the apes, I suppose, to keep humans away from their crops, which is one of the things they're worried about. And this, it's that first little foreshadowing that some other species is ascendant, and that human beings are at the bottom, and are being treated like animals. Basically, they're like the birds that have to be kept away from the crops. So.
And the build-up in the first half hour with the music, and when they're walking, you just know something's going to happen, and that is the first sign. Like, okay, there's something here. Everything feels fearful. With
the score is an amazing score, and it's such a suitable score because the film. Remember the part where Taylor says it's a madhouse. It's a madhouse. The film in a way is about madness because it's about the threat of dissolution of identity, and the score perfectly captures that. This jarring, identity compromising reality. So.
This man here had a question.
Okay. So I agree the movie's ultimately about the kind of the downsides of civilization. But my experience of watching the movie is the first half hour feels really pro-civilization, right? The tension between Taylor and the other astronaut. Taylor seems like a jerk for the other astronaut who's more civilized, who's thinking about tradition. Why am I going to be with Taylor's side? And then later when we first meet the humans, we're repelled by the fact that they're savages. Oh, these guys should have civilization. We're wandering around without food. If we were in civilization, we'd have food and safety. So do you think, do you view that as a contrast with the anti-civilization themes, or am I supposed to have that kind of whiplash?
So I don't think, am I contradicting myself to say I don't think the film is anti-civilization? I think it's anti-pro-civilization. It's
nuanced.
yeah, it's I don't think it's anti-civilization. You know, what do we? But it's anti this idea that what ails civilization is specifically the instinctual, and that it can be left behind. But we're stuck with civilization. I mean, we're not. There's no way really to move beyond that, and in a way, that's the point, right?
So Taylor's not a missing link because he's not the missing link to the Übermensch.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's like you said too. Freud said we're stuck with it, but you can't renounce the savagery part. You gotta know that in order to survive civilization. I guess is what I heard you say.
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
Which is harder to do.
You research this movie more than others. Have there been analytic interpretations of the movie?
you know, I couldn't find any. I didn't have time to do a ton of research. There is a book out there, but it's more about the politics of this, and its commentary, its critique of culture, and its relation to 60s counterculture and everything that was going on. I forget the name of that book, but I didn't find any psychoanalytic literature specifically about this. I mean, I did see that there are a few papers on PEP that reference the Planet of the Apes, but
well, now we have one. Now there will be one. You're gonna.
Yeah, I'll have to just polish this up and.
Do you mind saying what got you interested in the movie?
Yeah, so again, I think I must have seen it when I was really young, and had that dream about it. And then when did I watch it again for the first time as an adult? I'm not sure, but I like this era in film. I like these late 60s and then 70s movies. I see it as a golden age of cinema where it's great storytelling, and then in the character of Taylor, who's so flawed. I think there are a lot of things you see in this film which you're not going to see a lot of in contemporary films, from the pacing in the beginning, the Taylor's flawedness, the fact that he's really arrogant and kind of a prick, but it's done really well so that he's also charismatic, and he invites you to see him as a protagonist. I think that would be, as far as, in my experience, that's something you don't see in contemporary movies. But then also you see scenes with them awkwardly on that raft or tumbling, trying to get down a hill, long shots that are, without dialogue, that kind of pacing and all that stuff. So when I'm always impressed when I watch these movies about, by how much art there is to it, and it's, and these are Hollywood movies, and I think they're less about spectacle than contemporary movies. But as far as what really attracted me, before I had ever really thought through or formulated this thesis about connecting it to all these thinkers, is, maybe honestly it's Taylor's narcissism when it comes down to it. I probably identified and delighted in his, and felt the delight of his, and I think I'm captured by the fantasy of leaving it all behind. I'm captured by this fantasy of casting off the earth. And there are other characters who are actually, in literature, I find similarly compelling. Like, so Satan in Paradise Lost. so another charismatic, unlikely hero who has left it all behind. So in a way, the fall of Satan and the angels that went with him is just it's a kind of conscious repudiation and leaving behind. And then, so for instance, Coriolanus and Shakespeare, the same sort of thing. This sort of arrogant narcissist whose pride has been wounded and is willing to leave behind his entire society, and he actually goes over to the enemy. But I think that there's something about the successful depiction of that, which is it's attractive. And as you were saying, and I think others were saying, there's just something about seeing him, this person who's acting as if he's so self-sufficient and he's running around punching apes in the face and trying to escape and doing all these things. There's just something inevitably compelling about that. And then the second part of that is the how poignant it is to see someone like that laid low and ultimately to be made to mourn and to be made to get beyond all that stuff. And of course, the iconic ending. I mean, maybe it's all about the ending, because I think that really, at least there was a time when everyone knew that ending, and it was sort of an iconic part of the culture. So.
Well, I'm glad you didn't leave it all behind and you came here to share this with us. Thank you, you wonderful audience, and thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.